Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Accelerating ERP Implementations through Kyriba webinar today. My name is Katie Bull, and I'm our Business Development Associate here at Lear. Before we get into the presentation today, I just want to cover a couple housekeeping items. First, all attendees are going to be placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. There's going to be 3 poll questions throughout the webinar. We encourage your participation. If you guys have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them at the bottom in the Q&A portal, or you can also chat them to the speakers. We'll have a time at the end to answer Q&As. Also, a recording of the presentation today will be sent out in a follow-up in a couple of days. And you can also find this recording and all past Lear webinar recordings on our Lear YouTube channel and lear.com. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Chris Leininger, to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Katie. Like you said, our topic today is going to be accelerating ERP implementations through Kyriba. To get things started, we're going to go over a quick agenda. So we're going to start off with brief introductions and about Lear. Our next topic is going to be ERP migration challenges. Then we're going to talk about what connectivity as a service is and go into a breakdown of what Kyriba offers. And then we're going to get into some numbers and metrics regarding Kyriba versus legacy ERP. And then as Katie mentioned, we'll have a brief Q&A depending on time. So quick introductions. My name is Chris Langer. I'm a senior consultant within our Treasury COE. With me today presenting, I have Kai Christensen, who is also a consultant within our Treasury COE. Kai and myself are members of our software as a solution Treasury practice. We have led a number of ERP implementations, both on-prem and cloud-based. Just a little bit about Lear. We have a number of different service offerings, some of you may be familiar with, and we are very proud of our platinum partnership with Kyriba itself. And that should lead us into our first poll question.
Thank you, Chris. The first poll question is going to be, has your company begun to explore the potential of an ERP migration to cloud? I'll give you guys about 15 seconds to answer. I'm going to close it out here. So it looks like we have a split between there's been talk and no plan set in place, and people have already migrated to a cloud application.
All right, well, as Chris and Katie said, thank you for joining. My name is Kai. I do work in our Treasury Software as a Service practice. As Chris mentioned, I've spent the last couple of years working on Kyriba connectivity projects. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today about, exactly what kind of connectivity of a service is, how it can help your organization, and talk through some of the challenges and unique benefits of the application service that they provide. As many of you may be aware, as we saw in the poll question, some of you guys have already made the migration to cloud services. But one of the most difficult components of ERP implementations tends to be the connection with those banks. The complexity, the amount of testing, the entire process tends to be one of the more risky components of an implementation, and often one of the pieces that can throw off timelines and budgets within that cycle. So I want to quickly talk through some of the challenges. Highlighting these helps us understand the unique value and benefit of Kyriba's connectivity as a service, and ultimately lets us see some of those contrasts between historically, implementing legacy ERP systems versus using this more agile, this more efficient system of Kyriba's connectivity as a service. So the first challenge I want to talk about is assuming the straightforward integration. So as everyone's probably very aware, a lot of the burden of these implementations falls on the IT teams within organizations. So this straightforward integration concept is really the idea that as a corporation starts looking at the available connections with different banks, they start assuming typically that, okay, we've picked the direction, we understand what we want to do for connecting with banks, let's deploy it to our banks. But the reality is that one solution for connecting to bank A may not be the solution that works for connecting to bank B. There's many considerations from bank size and location to the number of accounts to the server structure that those banks may have as well. So This idea that we can have a one solution kind of fits all, or one size fits all for bank connection, really isn't the reality what we see in the market. And it can definitely become a challenge for corporations as they start, evaluating how to go ahead and connect individually with these banks. The next challenge that we see is the lack of standardization for multi-bank enterprise. So really, the idea here kind of feeds off of the first one, but multi-bank means a lot of things to different corporations. If we've got 3 banking partners, or we've got 30 or 50, the idea that we can, again, not only implement the same method connecting to the bank, but the same method for sending and receiving data with those banks, it varies a lot. And so the understanding that the standardization really isn't there between banks, not only through standardized formats like the ISO XML payment format. Yes, it's a standard, but banks employ it differently. And even though the way the structures of those files are built, the actual individual value requirements within those files change across banks. So again, this lack of standardization really can create heavy testing loads for clients during the implementation of their ERPs. As you can see here, that some estimates put the cost of implementing each bank between $100,000 and $300,000, depending on the complexity. Because again, even though there is things like standardized formats, the actual population of those standardized file formats really can vary across banks, across regions, and across different entities within a company. Those two really boil into the infrastructure costs. So again, a lot of the burden for these ERP implementations does fall on IT teams, and specifically the actual cost of the upfront implementation of this testing process, as we talked about the last point, varying into the high 6 figures. But not only that initial testing, but the ongoing maintenance of these connections and of those formats that are established, because requirements change for bank payment formats over time, and it's important to understand that and have a plan for not only how do we establish these connections, but how do we over time maintain them and make sure that they're staying modern with changing formats in the future. And then again, the banking formats, like we've talked about, as far as the lack of standardization, but the individual granular nature of these formats is a wide scope. There's the individual banks, individual countries, individual recipients, cross-currency payments, all these different things require different payment formats through the bank. And if you don't have a plan or don't already have those developed, it creates a feedback loop of send a file to the bank, get feedback, recode the way your application's populating those payment file formats, wash, rinse, repeat. And that can happen many times for a single payment format scenario. So once you extrapolate that idea to many payment format scenarios across an ERP implementation, the complexity really mounts and the challenges really become apparent. And ultimately, all of these factors can boil down to delayed projects. These connections do need to be constructed initially, and they do need to be rebuilt as organizations potentially migrate to the cloud. As we saw from that poll question, some companies, some people here are thinking about making that change. Some have already made that change. But definitely, it's a huge consideration, all these different challenges, when thinking about undertaking that kind of project.
Thank you, Kai. Our second poll question is going to be, what is the level of effort required today to collect your cash payment / bank statement data from your banks? High level, medium, or low? I'll give about 15 seconds to answer. I'm going to close out the polling. It looks like most of the people, Kai and Chris, are on low level of effort currently. And I'll pass it to you, Kai, to continue.
Well, that is great. Low level of effort to go ahead and collect banking information is always great, but ideally we want to get you to a no level of effort. Spending time with your treasury teams collecting information like that is time that could be better spent doing an actual analysis, or actually creating different reports that can ultimately provide more value to your organization. So connectivity as a service really allows us to get down to the bottom of that scale. I'm glad nobody's got a high level of effort, and there's not a great need, but ultimately connectivity as a service can get us to that point where this is a pain-free process to collect and aggregate information from different banks in different countries. So what is connectivity as a service for those who aren't familiar? It's just a managed data transmission fee between clients and their banks. It provides low-cost, safe transmission, And it also provides a lot of value, more so than just the actual connection, but how do we implement some of the files that are being sent back and forth. It does help us eliminate the need to pay some high premiums or manage multiple relationships. So think about just a strain on maintaining your connections through your IT team, as well as contracted service fees through banks or through ERP services as well. It does provide a huge amount of access to hundreds of active bank connections, tens of thousands of people formats. So again, that the leveraging, something that's established versus having to build something from scratch and maintain it, as we talked about in those challenges, is really going to be a value there. And ultimately, all of this functionality with the bank is going to be pre-built and pre-tested, which really can help us drive the goal of this webinar, which is accelerating these global banking connectivity projects by more than 80%, from a time perspective. And so now what I really want to do is kind of speak more to the individual components that really make this service not only more effective, more affordable, but also efficient and more valuable. So there's kind of 4 key components to this connectivity through Kyriba that I want to discuss. So the first is bank connectivity. So again, this is how exactly are we actually creating the connections with these banks to go ahead and send files. So I like to think of it as a bridge between the organization and their banks. So it's the method by which information is traveling. The payment format library itself, as well as the statement format library, is the information being passed along that bridge. So what payments, what files types are we sending? What statement files are we receiving? Are we receiving other types of information from the banks as far as custom reports? Or are we receiving, fee statements? All of these things are going to be things that are going to be pre-built and pre-tested through the Kyriba network, which really gives them a unique advantage in helping to, accelerate these processes for implementing ERP systems. And then payment fraud is a unique value. It's not as much about the speed and efficiency for implementing the tool, as much as how valuable the tool can be. So how do we address a climate of increased payment fraud within corporations, and make sure that we have an effective strategy to monitor and evaluate the payments going out the door, so that ultimately we're not going to be exposed to payment fraud in an unnecessary way. And finally, bank monitoring. How do we make sure that, when we're sending and receiving files, that they're reaching their destination? How do we make sure things aren't slipping through the cracks? This is a process that's typically more manual and more excessively, time draining when implementing through legacy systems and ERPs and through banks directly. And it's something that, a unique value proposition that Kyriba's connectivity service can really offer clients to address these issues. So I hope that interested you, because we're going to dig into those topics a bit more in depth here. So the Kyriba connectivity, again, what is the bridge? What is the method by which we're actually connecting to all of these different systems? So this diagram here kind of helps us visualize what that data flow looks like. So in the middle here, you're seeing Kyriba connectivity. So this is really the hub of activity for information flowing between systems. On the left-hand side there, you're going to see a bank. So how are we actually connecting to each of these banks? Going back to that list of challenges for integrating an ERP system, one of those main challenges, assuming it's going to be straightforward for each bank, there's typically a process when implementing bank connectivity through ERP systems to evaluate each bank individually when we go through these projects. So we have to say, what are our main tools that can connect to most banks? Can we do host-to-host connections with FTPs, safe, secure, easy to monitor transmissions? Is it going to be more cost advantageous for us to develop Swift connections through these banks? Whether it's Kyriba's leveraged, Swift Service Bureau, there's the Alliance Lite 2 network through Swift that Kyriba can connect to. And for corporations that don't have their own Swift BIC, they can actually use Kyriba Swift BIC for concentrator services for bank statements. So, it's a toolbox that Kyriba brings to this approach, and we can go bank by bank and say, here's our favorite tools in the toolbox, and what are the options that works for you. Again, many banks will be large enough to have, the more straightforward connections like host to host, but there's also small and regional protocols for connecting to banks that Kyriba can offer as well. So if you do have small banking partners in remote locations where there's typically less options from a standardized connection perspective, Kyriba really does bring a holistic approach, to being able to evaluate what's needed and ultimately find a solution that works for the client and the bank. Similarly, down below, many clients in our ERP systems will have market data information that needs to be fed into the application to help process other types of decisions, other types of activities. So you're seeing here examples of different market data feeds like Thomson Reuters, Bloomberg's, BlackRock, or Kyriba's Fire apps. All of these are great tools that can help clients make decisions, that can help process different types of transactions within the applications. And they all need to be fed in somehow. So again, what tools are we using? How are we building that bridge of connectivity through Kyriba to ultimately centralize, reduce costs, and increase speed of implementation for all of these different types of data, whether it's bank or market data? And on the right-hand side of the Kyriba connectivity hub, that globe in the middle, as we like to refer to it, is the ERP system. So, what's the method of actually passing information from the hub to and from your ERP system? You can see the types of activity that we're talking about here as far as payments and forecasts and accounting entries that are all flowing to and from the application. But ultimately, again, we've got the same kind of evaluation process for how we want to connect our application to Kyriba's connectivity, whether it's a direct host-to-host connection or whether it's utilizing one of Kyriba's APIs to get simultaneous information flow to and from the application. These methods are constantly being developed by Kyriba to consistently address new and changing needs of clients, ERP systems, and banks. And ultimately, when using connectivity as a service, you're getting access to all of these different options, so that again we can efficiently, evaluate what we need and figure out what's going to be best served for that specific requirement. Jumping into the payment and statement format library, again, this is another very, very unique value with Kyriba because their team is constantly developing these new formats in an ever-changing world. There's currently a format library with over 45,000 different payment scenarios, which is actually made up of more than 800 individual format variations. So again, this is where there's immense value in utilizing Kyriba's connectivity as a service, because that process I mentioned before, as far as one of those challenges with the bank where you're going through recoding, redriving fields into certain payment file values, testing with the bank, going back to that process and rerunning through all of those. Not only are a lot of those pre-baked, so all you need to do is put some small tweaks on a bank-by-bank basis or format-by-format basis to generate those payment files, but then it's pre-tested as well. So yes, they're going to be going through some form of testing for payments. Everyone always does, but the amount of time and effort that can be saved, not only from an overall project perspective, but from your IT team perspective, is immense. You don't need IT staff members staffed on these implementation projects to ultimately get these formats developed for connectivity as a service projects. And that same thing applies to the statements. Whether you're implementing or integrating more standard statements like BAI2s from your US banking partners or more far-fetched ones from your global partners, these are all going to be pre-built and pre-tested within Kyriba. Now, I say with a small grain of salt, there is a potential scenario that you've got a small banking partner in a remote part of the world that doesn't have a developed format for it within Kyriba. Now, while these situations are rare because it is more of your one-off, unique, small scenarios, if there is a scenario like that, Kyriba will actually develop those formats for you for free. Now, while it won't be quite as expedient as the developed format library, there's also unique value in this, in the fact that Kyriba their connectivity as a service is a cloud-hosted function. So if other clients of Kyriba in those far-flung reaches of the world are already developing those payment formats, because it's a cloud solution, every time there's an update to the application, every single client gets that entire update. So when that unique far-flung partner of Kyriba on the other side of the world develops that new payment format, it ultimately flows into this format library for use by any other of their clients or partners across the globe. So I mentioned that they'll build that for free. There's a full-time dedicated staff of different Kyriba employees that are constantly developing new formats for different banks, different payments, different statements, etc. So ultimately, this number keeps growing. The last time I saw a presentation similar to this one, it was 40,000 plus, and now it's 45,000 plus. So ultimately, this is quickly one of the fastest and largest growing format libraries out there in the world today, available for both payments and statements. And ultimately, what does this allow corporations to do? So, with the ability to quickly and efficiently and effectively cost-wise add new banks, It gives the ability to change and add banks efficiently, so corporations can reevaluate if they've got a fee structure that banks won't negotiate on. Can we reevaluate these relationships? Can we explore new ones with other banks, because there's not the fear of the work going into, it's going to be a huge project to implement these new banks, these new partnerships, these new payment testings, etc. So you can add and change banks easily to reduce fees. It can simplify adding new payment scenarios for cross-border payments. Using things like APIs, we can create real-time payments flows through the ERP to the bank, and ultimately it allows corporations to centralize their approvals, controls, and operations, so there's visibility into all of these different functions throughout the application and throughout this connectivity process. So jumping into now that we've kind of covered the what are the components that help us stand up this solution quickly? How do we quickly implement, cost-effective wise implement it? What's going to be the service component? Not only is the connectivity as a service feeding the fact that library is being maintained on a basis, but there's also the options for payment fraud detection. As you can see here, according to a study from last year, 81% of companies were targets of payment fraud. And as using the chart on the bottom of the screen, you can see that this is rising over time. So with this increased threat through the years, companies really need a strategy for how to address this and how to ultimately prevent it as best they can. In Kyriba's payment fraud detection through their connectivity service is definitely a unique value here. There's many ways in which it helps, but the fraud detection scenarios is kind of the core of how we address this rising risk. So every single payment that gets issued through connectivity as a service runs through these fraud detection scenarios. And these detection scenarios can be based on a huge list of factors. Are we paying bank accounts we've never paid before? Are we paying bank branches we've never paid before? Are we paying country branches of banks that are in countries that are on OFAC screening lists for sanctions? Is this amount that's being paid higher than we're expecting for this certain vendor? Is it more frequent than we're expecting for this certain vendor? The list goes on and on for ways you can structure these fraud detection scenarios. And ultimately, once one of those scenarios is found in this payment screening process, there's real-time alerts and notifications for these specific users that these are going to be affecting. So these alerts are going to feed into this fraud prevention workflow, which really lets you, customize how exactly you want these potential risks to be addressed. We don't always want to just cancel the payment right away. There's always going to be a scenario where you're paying a new vendor or you're paying a new country. And so how do we set up an efficient, consistent workflow to make sure that these are properly analyzed and ultimately can be reported on and have audit trails on to make sure that we, there's confidence in the idea of the decisions we're making using this fraud prevention workflow. And there's reports that we can push out to help us back up those decisions and ultimately understand exactly what this consistent process for payment fraud evaluation is going to be within the future. And then the last component of those four that I mentioned for connectivity service is going to be bank monitoring. So Kyriba offers advanced support. So I talked about the bridge, right, of how we're connecting with these different applications, but how do we make sure that, a car didn't fly off the side of the bridge and we didn't see it, right? So we're going to get monitoring for statement delivery to make sure that, if the bank's pushing statements, we're going to be getting them, or if the bank's not pushing them, we're going to know about it. Same thing with payment activity. We're going to make sure if we're sending payments to this application, they're ultimately getting to their destination of the bank. And so we can create client-established schedules to monitor these different types of activity and know immediately, proactively, if there's going to be issues with any of the data that we're sending. And if there is any issues with something and, these reports are pointing out issues that we had hoped to address, there's a telephone and email assistance available to go ahead and pick up the phone, send an email, and make sure that these issues are addressed quickly once they're identified. There's also more user-initiated monitoring, simple reports that can be run automatically on a daily basis for an exception basis as well. So you consider them red flag reports. A simple bank connection status saying, hey, we expected this many statements today. Did we get this many statements? And if not, tell us in our report so we can go ahead and investigate. Payment acknowledgement statuses are very similar. Is the bank sending us a file saying, hey, we got your payment, it looks good format-wise, and we process it. It's simple information that's very helpful, and it's a big issue if you don't have it when there are things that might slip through the cracks that might not process successfully. We can really save a lot of headache by kind of proactively monitoring these connections and ultimately the data that's being passed to and from their sources on these connections. And all of these things can be daily automated and sent out by distribution lists or directly into your ERP application so that they're easy to consume and easy to understand. And just relating this back to this diagram, this is again just making sure these arrows of data flowing between the different pieces of the application are being monitored, and so making sure that all of the data is reaching its destination. If we're going through all the work to set up these communications, let's make sure that they're flowing properly and consistently.
Thank you, Kai. We're to our last and final poll question of the day. It's going to be, how long does it take you to onboard a new bank connection? I'll give about 15 seconds to answer. And I'm going to close the poll out. It looks like we have a mix of people between 0 and 3 months and 3 to 6 months. I'm going to pass it to Chris to finish off the presentation.
Thank you, Katie. So now that we've gone through what the functionality that Connectivity as a Service provides through Kyriba, we want to break down what the cost looks like. So we want to do a cost comparison of what does that look like to deploy and test a single bank using Kyriba's connectivity versus doing so on a traditional ERP. And what we can see is that Kyriba offers this for a much cheaper rate. For the deployment and the testing of a bank, on Kyriba costs around $2,400, whereas typically on an ERP implementation, it can cost upwards to $150,000. So that's almost a 60 times difference between Kyriba and the ERP counterpart. And we have a number of factors that go into that. I mean, you're working on bank timelines, you're meeting bank specific connection requirements, payment file, bank statement file requirements, as well as resource restraints. I mean, you have to include people on the project that are going to be developing these different payment files, be developing those different payment connections for the specific bank and the accounts associated with it. So we really see quite a difference between cost when leveraging a connectivity as a service solution. Next, we will be getting into what a typical timeline looks like for doing a project just within the ERP. So not using connectivity as a service. And we know, based on that previous poll question, that this typically takes around 6 months. I mean, from, again, working on the bank's timeline, getting all the pieces together and getting that deployment and development done of the specific connections or files needed to have that communication with your bank developed and tested. And, we have a number of requirements that we got to fit through. That timeline can be elongated and prolonged a lot further along than a timeline that is leveraging connectivity as a service. So going from 6 months, up to a year, if not more, this can be cut down to a matter of weeks, because within Kyriba and their offering, they have all those pre-established connections, those pre-built payment file formats or bank statement formats that are ready to go at your fingertips. And then lastly is our annual cost maintenance. So just because we have, our connectivity and our formats ready to go doesn't mean they don't need to be maintained over the year. I mean, we're seeing new payment files being delivered year over year. We have changes and requirements that, as Kai had mentioned, a bank could require, at BMO versus JP Morgan. But we also see the standardization of certain payment files being done as well too. We know that the Swift community is standardizing to the ISO layout. And so there's constant maintenance that needs to be done within your banking connectivity that Kyriba offers and does provide for you. So typically we're seeing maintenance costs of between $10,000 to $20,000 a year within the ERP itself, whereas again, Kyriba, as you subscribe to the service, it's only costing you around $2,400 a year. And so to kind of tie that all together, we see development and testing costs is dramatically decreased when looking at Kyriba's connectivity as a service. We see timeline to production going from several months to a matter of weeks, and we see our maintenance costs similar to the development testing incredibly slashed down from, again, that $10,000 to $20,000 a year to about $2,400 a year. So the return on investment is there. And lastly, just 3 major key takeaways we want to highlight again when looking at leveraging a solution like connectivity as a service is the cost. I mean, you see that drastically decrease. Kyriba reduces the cost of implementing and maintaining bank connectivity. We have our time. Implementation projects that used to take months or years can be completed in a matter of weeks. And then we have that stability, that support that Kyriba offers. They have advanced support to companies so that they have that confidence that their connectivity solution is monitored and proactively monitored, and that issues are detected before they become problems. And so I think at that time, Katie, if we do have time, we want to open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, I think we have time for 2 questions, Chris. Thank you. The first one's going to be, how does a project implementation using Kyriba differ from a traditional ERP implementation?
So I can take this one. Thanks, Katie. There's going to be a lot of differences. As we've discussed, the main ones are going to be really the requirements from the team that's implementing them. So using the connectivity service, we really do take almost, if not all, of the burden off of your IT team. So because of those factors we've talked about, you can really accelerate the rate of those projects as well. Those timelines that Chris showed us were pretty drastic as far as what a holistic project looks like. And we can see on a per bank basis, if you can dial something down from 3 to 6 months to implement a new bank to a matter of weeks, the timelines are going to be the big differences, the cost, and then the ultimate requirement from the client.
Thank you, Kai. And the last question we have time to answer is, what component drives down the cost the most?
So again, there's going to be the same kind of factors we've been discussing today on what single component drives down the most, and it's going to depend. Every project's a bit different from the client requirement standpoint, but I think definitely that payment format and the statement format library that's pre-developed, because it does drive down the feedback time. So overall cost based on time, but then the amount of internal resources required. Those components in and of themselves are huge value drivers. So I think those are probably the single most valuable component of using Kyriba Connectivity Service for the implementation process.
Thank you, Kai. That's all we have time for today in the Q&A. If you guys have any additional questions, we will be sending out a follow-up email, and you're more than welcome to respond to that with any questions you have. But I just want to thank everyone again for taking time for joining us today for the webinar. Just a reminder, we will be sending out the recording so you guys can view it then. And as always, engage with Lear on social media. We're always posting new content weekly. And thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.